Let's talk a bit more about Azure DNS and the options that we've got. Of course, DNS name resolution is the foundation of the internet in that it gives us the ability to resolve user-friendly names to numerical IP addresses. And as such, users don't have to remember those IPs. We use this so much we actually don't even think about it, but behind every the use of any domain name is name resolution. It has to be resolved to an IP. And of course, that exists in cloud environments as well. And Azure provides numerous DNS options for companies that are using a hosted infrastructure. Let's talk about some key points first. Every tenant has a default .onmicrosoft.com name. That name cannot be changed. This is, often created in conjunction with Office 365, but it would, Office 365 is going to create an Azure AD tenant, and then technically you can just enable an Azure subscription within that particular tenant. So that onmicrosoft.com name doesn't change, and it's basically just intended to be used until a custom domain is verified. So you can create additional custom domains, and that can, of course, simplify the user experience because we just use a domain name that we actually own. It'll, if nothing else, simplify a user sign-on experience. But again, many times this is in conjunction with Office 365. I know this is an Azure class, and I'm not trying to go down that road, but we have to understand that these are connected. And in the real world, personally, I've never seen a company that was using Azure and not using 365. Now, I'm sure, having said that it exists, that they exist out there, but my point is they are extremely rare. Okay, so usually the custom domains have already been added to the tenant because that's what we're getting email on. And just because somebody migrates to 365, they don't want to have to start using the on Microsoft addresses. But we can go in and actually create custom domains within Azure Active Directory as well. Now, you do have to be a global admin to do anything having to do with domain management. The global admin is the initial person who created the subscription or anybody who's granted rights. Domain names, of course, are globally unique. So if it belongs to another tenant, you can't add it to yours. So on and so forth, and the domains must be verified. You can't just go in and say, I'm in control of, yahoo.com. They will ask you to create text records on the authoritative DNS server, and then Azure will query for those text records to verify that you actually own that domain. In this demonstration, we're going to look at adding a custom domain. This is actually not something that's done within the Azure portal, but instead is done either in the Office 365 portal or the Azure AD portal. Okay, so most of the time people that use Azure cloud-based services also utilize Office 365 in some capacity. If that doesn't happen to be true for you, then you would simply start at the Azure portal, click on the navigation pane, and then go down to Azure Active Directory. I said that last part just because myself, 9 times out of 10, I'm actually not using Azure AD in order to create this. I'm instead using the Office 365 portal. But you technically can do this in both places. In a Azure AD portal, we're going to go down to custom domain names. Okay, notice we've got a few domain names that are listed in here. So everybody's going to have the onmicrosoft.com domain name based on what your tenant is called. That cannot be changed. That cannot be removed. However, you can create additional domains. You simply add a custom domain and specify what the name of that domain is. Have to use a domain extension, obviously. Then we click Add Domain. Now, at that point, it goes into the verification status. And the verification is going to either be via text record or via MX record. Text records are generally the easiest, so they give you the values right here. The alias or host name is either going to be blank or the @ symbol. The value or points to, you would just copy and paste this. And then a TTL of 3600 seconds is pretty standard. All we have to do is we have to go to the public DNS to then add that record and then come back here and click on verify. Okay, now if I click verify right now, it's of course going to fail. And if I kind of dig into that, we're just going to see, well, it failed to verify. In other words, they didn't find that record. Now, that's kind of where our demonstration is going to stop short. I just wanted to show you where to do it. We can also look at the Office 365 portal, and I'll just show you where to do it there. Because really, you do have the choice. The choice is going to be yours. Let's go to all apps here. and admin. A lot of times your administrators won't be licensed, so they won't have all of those applications. But if they do, and you can't see it, just go to All Apps. So in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, we would go down under Settings, and that's where we're going to find domains. Now notice my list of domains is going to be the exact same. So I've got my company ABC in here and an incomplete setup. And if I were to click on it and click Start Setup, then it's going to prompt me to go through this verification process by adding a text record to an authoritative DNS server. Most of you, your DNS is probably hosted by GoDaddy, Wix, Network Solutions, Namecheap, you name it, but those seem to be some of the more popular ones. And so that's where we have to go. We're not talking about a private DNS server. We're talking about a public that is accessible from the internet. And all this system is going to do is query that system to determine if this record is there. Because if it's there, then it proves that you own that particular domain. We should be able to click Start Setup, and it's just going to show me it's got the exact same MX record. Yet another just kind of example of where all of this stuff is tied together. We're in the same tenant. We're utilizing the same instance of Azure AD. And so whether I use the M365 portal or the Azure AD portal to add my custom domains is really of no matter. Now, in addition to adding custom domains and just some standard DNS stuff, we have the Azure DNS service, which is a reliable and secure DNS service within virtual networks. This actually functions without the verification of a custom domain, and it has several different components. The first component is a DNS zone. Now, the nice thing here is, again, if you've got any network background at all, deal with Active Directory networks, then we probably know DNS pretty well, or at least some of this terminology. Just in case, I'm going to cover it, but this should be review. The cloud versions of this are not really that much different than the on-prem version. So what is a DNS zone? Well, it is just a collection of DNS records for a particular domain. Typically, DNS zone is synonymous with domain, but not always, so it could contain a parent domain and then child domains, but it's just a collection of resource records. So to start and it resides on a DNS server that is then going to respond to queries for records within that particular zone. So to start hosting your domain in Azure DNS, you'd actually create a DNS zone for that domain name. Now we're going beyond now just adding a custom domain. We're saying we want Azure DNS servers and DNS service to be responsible for name queries. So you'd create a zone, and then within the zone you would create individual records. Now the records are like A records. Here's a name, here's an IP address. CNAME records is an alias. MX records, things of that nature. You do have something called a DNS record set in Azure. And this is a bit different. A record set is a collection of records in the zone, and all of those records have the same name and the same type. So like they're all CNAME records. They're all A records, that kind of thing. So they're going to be different, but we just need to understand that. Okay, record sets they have multiple records, but they can't contain two identical records. Then you have DNS delegation, and this is the same concept that we have in regular DNS. Delegation means we are delegating authority to another DNS server so that they are responsible for this particular zone. So we would delegate the domain to Azure DNS. And so you start by knowing the name servers that you have currently for your zone, because there are going to be NS records, name server records that are in there. And then we have to then go in and create a delegation saying, okay, no, now we're going to actually delegate this to the Azure DNS servers. All right. We also have the options for private domains and private zones. We'll talk through some of these as we go along, but when you're using private zones, you can use your own custom domain names rather than the Azure provided names. And so that helps you just to kind of tailor the virtual network setup to meet your particular needs. And so we're able to host private zones within DNS. I mean, this is basically the primary benefit of doing that. And the scenarios would be, name resolution just within a single virtual network using a private domain. And you also can support name resolution for multiple networks using that private domain name. In this demonstration, we're going to look at configuring Azure DNS or DNS zones. Now, there's a couple of places where you can actually do DNS configuration. One of them is on the VNet itself, so let me check that first. This really is just going to be what DNS servers are you using. And so we've got two choices. We've got the default of Azure provided, or we've got custom DNS servers. And the custom DNS server, you can add in there the address of one or more DNS servers that you want to utilize. Now, this is utilized when Azure-based virtual machines are joined into an Active Directory domain. That Active Directory domain could exist only in Azure, which is uncommon. It could exist in an on-premises environment. It could exist in an on-premises environment that is extended to Azure with a VPN, okay? And in that case, there might be a domain controller for that environment in Azure. If there is, use the IP address of that, assuming it's a DNS server as well. If it's not, or there isn't one of those, then you would use the addresses of your on-prem servers, okay? Now, the little note about virtual machines within the network needing to be restarted is a good point. You can make changes to virtual machines. You can make changes at the network interface level, or you can make changes to DNS servers here at the VNet level, but in any case, they have to be restarted. And then remember, I believe I already said, don't ever make changes within Windows, or you will lose access to those VMs and you will have to recreate them. All right, so I'm just going to say the default Azure provided, because the other configuration that we can have is that of DNS zones. You can see I already searched for it, so it's there. So we can go in and we could create DNS zones, which are a list of resource records that can be used to resolve user-friendly names to IP addresses. I'm just going to use my existing test group here. This zone is a child of an existing zone, yes or no, and then we can just, basically have a name. So I'm just going to do mycompany.local. Okay, so there's my DNS zone name. There's not a whole lot to configure here at the zone level, just tags for metadata. So I'm going to go ahead and hit review and create. The validation passed, and we'll just click to create. It goes through the deployment process of deploying that zone. Now, those zones are deployed to the Azure DNS server, so you actually wouldn't create DNS zones in Azure if you were using your own custom DNS servers. If you're using your own custom DNS servers, they're running Windows, most likely, possibly bind on Linux or something, but most likely they're running Windows, and so you're just going to go in and manage DNS, and then simply point clients to utilize that DNS server. So it's really here in the zone that I would be going to create records and whatnot. All right, so let's go first and just see properties, just some statistics about this, not really much to do here. Locks are your ability to make this read-only if you want, and then back on the overview tab would be my ability to create a record set. So the name is first. The type of record that you want to create, and so we have all the standard types, the quad A records for IPv6, CNAME records for aliases, MX for mail exchange, SRV, text records, etc. Is it an alias record set? If it is, what type of alias it is, and then the Azure resource that it's going for. Otherwise, it's just a name and an IP address. 2. So we'll just add that because then we can test out that name resolution a little bit later. So that's just a simple creation of a record set. You can see the name servers are the Azure DNS servers. So all you're doing is adding in a zone and then creating individual records within that zone. All of this is hosted by Azure. Now, I did a private domain, but we can technically do, public domains as well. Obviously, we have to own those domains, but we can own those domains, have them hosted on, say, Network Solutions, and then move them into an Azure hosted DNS scenario. So we have a few clients that are starting to do that, my organization, but this is a relatively newer concept. It's the ability to allow Azure to host your DNS.